involvement, but this particular study is important because we are covering a lot of biblical issues. But one thing we're also learning to do is reason and discuss and be logical. For a lot of people, Christianity, or their faith, let's say it that way, is emotional. It's not based on reason or logic. It's purely emotional. And I think there needs to be a balance between both of those, being reasonable, rational, logical, and emotional about it. So, one verse I think of is like 1 Peter 3:15. Or is it 2 Peter? No, it's 1 Peter 3:15. Be ready always to give an answer. We need to be armed. Somebody read 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5.
Though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh.
2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5, yeah.
Though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ.
Okay, so Gail read from the New King James, casting down arguments, verse 5. The King James says casting down imaginations. The Greek word there means lofty opinions or speculations. So I kind of like that word, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. Well, atheism is one of those. One of those arguments, lofty speculations, things like this. So I told you last week I was going to share this quote with you, and I never did, so we'll start there tonight. Richard Dawkins was asked in an interview, what would it take for you to believe in God? And here was his answer, in part. He says, well, I am starting to think nothing would. Nothing would convince him that there's a God. Which in a way goes against the grain, because I've always paid lip service to the view that a scientist should change his mind when evidence is forthcoming. The trouble is, I can't think what that evidence would look like. And then you could insert to prove that there is a God. Let me flip back. Okay, so atheism. We talked about the fact last week briefly that there's this thing in logic called the law of the excluded middle. There's no middle ground. A thing either is or is not. There is either a God or there is not a God. To be rational, for a person to be rational, you look up that definition, essentially the law of rationality states that a person should only come to a conclusion based on the evidence. The evidence will lead you to a conclusion. That's reasonable, isn't it? But there are those who say that nothing will convince me. We've talked about nature, reason, life begets life. Non-life does not beget life. That's a fundamental reality. Fundamental law of science. And we talked about this. Most people let what they want to be true dictate what they believe. Me wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. So we looked at these 3 points. We're going to continue this thought tonight. This was a response from an atheist who watched our first video on atheism. First reason he gave for not being an atheist, I personally have never observed a God. So what did we say? What was our response to that? Yeah, neither have I. Yeah, there are a lot of things that we've not personally observed. Did any of you do any study on Nanking? No? All right. I have never encountered any person who has claimed to have observed a God. Well, to me, that's the same thing as number 1. And essentially, number 3 is number 2, just with more words to it. I know of no accounts of persons claiming to have observed a God. It's not only is that, you can reject that outright because it's, reality is not based on you. But from the Christian perspective, what does it mean to observe God? Like Robert said. I've not seen God. No man has seen God at any time. John 1, what is that? John 1:18 tells us that. So, for a couple of different reasons, you could ultimately reject these first three. What was that? God, yes, God is not material. You can't, I was reading an article today about laboratory experiments. You can't put God in a lab. You can't put God in a test tube. And it's interesting because one of the tasks that many scientists have occupied themselves with is trying to produce life from non-living matter. So let's think about that rationally for just a minute. They're trying to produce life from non-living matter. Do you see any contradiction there? What are you laughing at? But who's doing the experiment? Living people. Yeah, I mean, that's right. You can't get life from something non-living. This will never breathe. This thing doesn't have what we call the five senses. It will always be what it is. It'll never change into anything else, no matter what outside forces. If this gets smashed with a hammer, it's still this, isn't it? Now, it may be this in many pieces and now useless, but it doesn't become something different. All right? So, rationality is you come to conclusions based only on the evidence. Richard Dawkins. Okay. Any questions or comments on any of that stuff? I printed off some more things up here. I marked through the stuff that we talked about last week, and so I'm trying to keep myself in somewhat of an order. All right, let's talk about the law of cause and effect. We're talking about these various laws. What is the law of cause and effect? Yeah, just flip those words around. Every effect, this is an effect. But there was something that caused this. And the something that caused this, what would you say about it? It has to be greater than this. Okay, so this thing can advance a slide, it can reverse a slide, it's got a little light to it. You know, it's pretty neat technology, and it's wireless. The little transmitters back there, it's pretty neat, but it's certainly antiquated in terms of technology. We've had it for 8 years. There's much more advanced things now, but it works. The law of cause and effect is just that. Every effect, and when you're dealing with science, it's not just every effect, all right, everything. It's every material effect, because what are the options in science for the existence of all things? Yeah, observation, empirical evidence, things that you can put in the laboratory and repeat and form hypotheses with and come to conclusions based on what evidence you have. Every material effect has to have a cause that came before it and that was greater than it. I don't know who built this thing here, but they had to be fairly smart, handy, know how to use other tools to put this thing together, measurements and things like that. This thing just would not come to exist by itself without some agent that was more intelligent, intelligent in all. This thing's not smart and it's not dumb. It just is, right? So when we talk about the law of cause and effect, every material effect has to have a cause that preceded it and that was greater, that was more intelligent than the effect itself, okay? I was doing a little reading on the history of the development of these lines of argumentation. Plato, in 360 BC, was talking about these kinds of things. One thing he wrote was, the causes of everything, why each thing comes into existence or into being, and why it perishes and why it exists. That's something that he was working with. How did all this stuff come to be? Aristotle talks about this kind of stuff. So this is not a new discussion. All right, this has been going on for, I guess you would say, millennia. All right, so let's look at this fourth point, why this person, again, who reviewed our video, said they were an atheist. I have never been presented a valid logical argument. So what, in 2 Corinthians 10, part of his goal, we walk in the flesh, we're not warring according to the flesh, we're casting down what? Arguments. It's a matter of the mind. It's a matter of the soul. So this person says, I've never been presented with a valid logical argument which also employed sound premises. Premises are the arguments that you formulate in order to come to a logical conclusion. He says that lead deductively to a conclusion that a God exists. To me, there's a word I learned not long ago. I like learning new words. To me, that's rather circuitous. He went on a circuit to say something. He could have said it a lot simpler, I think. Deductive reasoning is the idea that you're trying to reach a conclusion, and you start with a general idea, nothing specific, a general idea. And you're going to come up with lines of reasoning that lead you to a conclusion that, based on what you're saying, they're all true. And so your conclusion then would have to be true. All right? Well, we'll get to that in just a second. Comes to a logical... So, first of all, let me say this about argument number 4 here. Have you noticed that every argument starts with, I have never? Or something along those lines. Okay, well, there are a lot of things I have never. I'll just say that. But that does not negate their existence or their reality or anything like that. So I think it's a dangerous thing to state every argument from the perspective of what you have or have not, personally experienced or have knowledge of. So let's talk about, again, reasoning, being rational, being logical, not just being emotional. There are a lot of folks who really struggle, I would say, and forget what we're talking about, but talking to people in general about Christianity, about their faith, and the conversation eventually turns just into an emotional back and forth. Well, that's just what I believe. Well, it doesn't make any sense. Well, that doesn't matter. It's what I believe. And that, I've seen religious discussions go that way, and well, when they go that way, you've not accomplished anything at all. What you've been doing is just essentially fighting, and that's not any good. You have to be able to tamp down your emotions and be reasonable and be rational and look at evidence. There's nothing wrong with asking questions about the Bible. There's nothing wrong with being asked questions about the Bible. That's one thing that you and I can never forget, which to me, when I think of that, that's why it's so important for us as Christians to know our stuff. Because if you have any impact outside of your spouse and children, people in the world, you will probably have some form of discussion. What are you going to do then? How are you going to handle that? So let's think about this. Okay, what does it mean? What does it mean to have or to use deductive reasoning, to deduce something? Well, again, you start out with a general idea, a general principle or premise, as this guy said in his comment, and you build on that general idea to come to a logical conclusion, and everything's true all the way down to the conclusion. Okay? I was trying to think of a good way to illustrate this, and I thought I had written it down. I was certain I probably wrote it down on something else. I've got a stack of papers on my desk that I've been working with preparing for this class. But I'll give you an example of bad reasoning, okay? Somebody might say, well, every car I have ever seen is red. Okay? Let's say you're driving a truck. Emily has a red truck, don't you? All right, every car I've ever seen is red. what you drive is red. My conclusion is you're driving a car. Is that true? Is your vehicle red? Is it a car? No. You can answer. Okay. So, I've only ever experienced red cars. What you drive is red, and so I conclude that, well, Emily drives a car, but, well, first of all, not every car is red. Second of all, you don't drive a car, you drive a truck. So that's faulty, that's irrational to say something like that. Every car is red. That would be irrational. So you don't want to make bad arguments, and bad arguments can come just from I have never. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to illustrate in the moment is don't make bad arguments. And I suppose in terms of religious discussions, well, I don't suppose, I know that we can do that kind of a thing. Make bad argumentation, be illogical, and be controlled strictly by our emotions, and you certainly don't want to do that. Any questions or comments on anything before I go a little further with this?
We kind of talked about that in the last couple of weeks. I think you said it. A whole lot of our problem is they don't believe in God in the first place, and they sure don't believe in the Bible because it's supposed to be something that came from God, and there is no God.
Yeah.
So, as Christians, we're just kind of, we're the irrational ones because we live by something that they don't even think is worth anything.
Well, that's one of the things that we pointed out a bit last week was Christians are superstitious. We believe in irrational things. To believe that there's a being who exists that you can't see and that's given us this book, that's irrational. But to believe that our entire existence is here through purely material causes is not irrational. And to me, and if you remember, I think this is 2 weeks ago, the more and more I've studied this and prepared for these particular classes, the ability to reason and consciousness may be some of the most powerful arguments for a conscious, intelligent being. And again, what I'm doing when I talk like that is I'm using their language. I don't talk like that, and like when I preach and teach and things like that. A conscious, intelligent being. We understand as Christians what Scripture says, and so we gather that God is conscious and intelligent and things like this. But it's good to be able to know how they speak, so we can, again, reason with them. If it is the case that everything exists purely from material causes, then how do you explain reason? How do you explain yourself being a conscious being? Okay, so just like this stand here. This stand will never become conscious, aware, awake. It will never have that capacity because it's an inanimate object. It's material, yes, but that's all it is. It doesn't have a soul, a mind, or anything like that. And so, to believe what is believed in the realm of atheism is wholly irrational. Yeah. Well, where the matter comes from, according to them, is it's always been. It's always been. That's. Yeah. It's always been. That's.
I know, and that is hard for
Yeah.
us to even wrap our minds around.
Right.
But I don't understand why they think it's matter has been here, always been here. You know what I mean?
Well, and one of the things that I mentioned last week, I don't remember how much time we spent on it, but the very laws of science contradict that idea that matter is eternal. Again, if you have nothing, what will you have 1,000,000 years from now? You will have nothing. That's just fundamental. That's a fundamental reality, okay? Well, if you have this stand, what will it be in 1,000,000 years? Well, it may just be a pile of dust. Who knows? It may just be nothing. It may just, nothing in the sense of what it's doing now. It may just be a pile of sand on the floor, or sawdust. Is that it? But it wouldn't change into something else. Its elements would still be the same. The material would still be, it would be in a different form, but it would still be itself. Just like saying that crushing this with a hammer wouldn't turn it into something else. It would just be a broken this. Yeah, exactly. However many pieces you break this into, if you were to reassemble it, it would be this all over again. And that was kind of one of the major flaws in Darwin's theory of evolution and essentially species jumping in the theory of evolution. Because in the theory of evolution, from where did we come? Our nearest relatives, DNA-wise, are chimpanzees. The problem, one of several problems with that is there is no evidence of a transitional being. There is no evidence of a being that was, well, it's like I said, I think it was last week. All living beings are either human or non-human. There's no middle ground. There's no one being that's in the process of transition from being this to being what we are. And there's no evidence that that ever took place, but that's what we're expected to believe. And it's not only that ridiculous, it's ridiculous to the point of, and kind of going what you were touching on what you were talking about, Tammy, that all living beings now, every living being is the ancestor of single cell, extremely primordial nothing. And nothing in the sense of not intelligent, not like we are, upright and talking and things like this. It's totally irrational. Totally irrational.
If we evolved from either chimpanzees or single cell, then why aren't we still? Why did we all of a sudden just get here and stop? Maybe is that anything they ever talk about?
Well, the argument back of, like what will we become? Are we the top of the, are we it? Are we evolving into something else? But the argument essentially in regard to that is it takes too long to know. You know, millions upon millions of years. But even at that, that's the thing. All the research that's been done in terms of the processes of evolution, you know, the evidence that's there is not there. You guys have heard the phrase, the missing link. That's kind of the idea. You know, that's kind of we don't use that phrase anymore. At least I don't ever hear it anymore. But what was between us and them, and what's between us and the next step of evolution?
Darwin himself said that the transitional species that you were talking about, they should have been found by now.
Well, sure, yeah.
He said that when he was formulating all this, if they're not found within the next 50 years, we need to start rethinking this.
Yes. Well, I would say, and this is my opinion, that Charles Darwin was more honest than modern atheism is. He knew the risks, I don't know if that's the right word. He knew the potential failures of his theory. And he was honest about it, just like that. You know, if they don't find it within so long, then they're not going to find it. I think he understood that. But
There is no history before what we say mankind started with God creating the world. But what they really believe, if what they say is true, it took so many millions of years. There's no history of and just in, what do we say, 20, I mean, how many years do we think that the world's been here as Christians? It's kind of a number.
Approximately 6,000 to 8,000 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
And things haven't changed that much compared to 50 million years. That's
Right.
not a very long time.
Right.
That's actually quite a short time compared to 50 million.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't, and there's no history or proof of any of what they say.
No history in the sense of like written history.
Other than they think they found human skulls that look like in between
Hey, let me tell you something. Do a little digging on this. If you make notes, write this down. Do a little digging on the fraudulent nature of like Neanderthals, the Piltdown Man, Lucy. Y'all remember hearing about Lucy? You studied it. Yeah. Well, you realize the way they came to their conclusions about what these creatures looked like was it was like they found half of a jawbone. One of them they found it was like a piece of the skull cap. And from that, they built this pre-human transitional species. And that's just not rational. And that's not, well, it's not honest. That's for sure. You can't recreate a being from a piece of the skull. But science has.
What do you think you look like?
I don't know. Yeah.
It takes a lot more faith to believe what they believe. That, God didn't put us here. He gave us His Word. He spoke to man, explained how we got here and why we're here, and He explained it all. And it takes a lot of faith to believe what they believe.
Well, there's a book I'll actually recommend. It's not written by a member of the church, but that's okay. Of course, Apologetics Press has a lot of good stuff, but I've got a book that I've read. It's called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. It's written by a man named Norman Gisler, and I've actually read several of his books. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Norman Gisler and Frank Turek. And Frank Turek actually has a lot of stuff on YouTube. Again, he's not what we would refer to as a New Testament Christian, but he claims to be a Christian, and he does a lot of debates. And one thing he has done is travel to like different universities and have lectures, but then he'll do a Q&A after the lecture. And there's a lot of good stuff he's done on YouTube. But that phrase you used reminded me of that book that I've read. And if you like to read, I'd get that one.
And you look back at Dawkins, he just had such a miserable life. And I just feel like a lot of people who believe this, they're just very miserable and they want to blame someone for their miserable existence. And
Yeah.
they end up, it's almost like a mental issue.
Well, for a lot, I think one of the major hang-ups for the existence of God is the existence of evil. And it wasn't Richard Dawkins, but there was another, okay, you guys in the young adults group. I shared a couple videos in our young adults group of an atheist talking about suffering and evil. I cannot remember his name at the moment. If any of you can remember it, that would be great. But he was very defiant. I think he had some form of cancer. And right before his death, in fact, that's the interview that I shared in our group. He was interviewed and extremely defiant. It's like basically he said, I'm doing this interview now because I'm still in my right mind. And if I ever lose my mind and say there's a God, just know that I believe there's not. Bitter, resentful, and, well, one of the ways I've heard it described as I've been reading more and more is hard atheists. He's a hard atheist. If you guys can remember that person's name, I would... Christopher Hitchens, that's it. Yep, Christopher Hitchens. He's got that was like a 30 or 40-minute interview, and just a hard, calloused individual.
Why are they wasting their time on us? If there's nothing after this life, why would they waste their time arguing with someone when they could be enjoying doing something to soak up every second they have on this earth?
Why would you dedicate your life to prove that something that doesn't exist doesn't exist?
Debating without that being
Yeah.
frustrating. Why would you try to bring any frustration to your life when you could enjoy it and be happy for the however many years you
Yeah.
have?
I don't know. I'm sure they have an answer for that, but I don't. It is a waste of time. Why not devote your life to something more profitable? There's just recently, I think it was at Faulkner University, Kyle Butt debated an atheist. I started watching it the other day. I got about 30 minutes in. But you might check that out. I forget the atheist's name, but Kyle Butt did a debate maybe just a week or two ago. I don't know, but it's out there and available now too. All right, so back to wherever we were. I've never been presented a valid logical argument which also employed sound premises, and again, premises are like the thing I illustrated with Emily. I did a bad one intentionally to show you that you can reason illogically, that lead deductively to a conclusion that a God exists. He doesn't believe it. There's nothing reasonable that can be presented to him. Well, let's talk about reason for just a minute. All right, let's go to Genesis chapter 1. Let's talk about reason, laws of nature. Somebody read Genesis 1, 11 to 13. All right, let's talk about rationality for just a minute. So if everything that exists, including me and you today, came from a simple, single-celled organism, each step that had to follow, that ultimately leads to us, every single step had to be, every step of transition had to be 100% successful every time. Because of what if it and how it would evolve from one thing to another, that's the other mystery. But if one thing, so, okay, trees, or grass rather, an herb yielding seed and trees and its fruit. If that grass is evolving into a tree, what kind of tree? How did it begin to produce seed that was at one time grass that became, you name the type of tree you want? Every minute process that would take place from this point to this point in that transition had to be perfect the very first time. Otherwise, what would happen? You got to start all over. There certainly wouldn't have been a tree, but I suppose that's maybe Timber kind of touching on what you mentioned. That's your need for the great expanse of time. Because, well, there are going to be failures. There are going to be genetic mutations. There are going to be defects, and the process has to start all over again. That is completely irrational to think that the processes have worked so, not accurately, but so accurately, that from what it started as to where we are now exists. That makes sense? Well, if I'm saying this correctly, I believe the estimates are the Earth itself is like 4.6 billion years old. 4 to 5 billion years old. But whatever was before that is approximately 13 billion. Now, 7 billion years, that's not a small number. 6 billion years, well, humans are what, 250,000 years old or 250 million years old? I don't know what the number is, but those are not small periods of time. Those are not inconsequential periods of time. One thing I want to do when we finish this class is I want us to study the book of Genesis, because there are theories, even within the Christian worldview, that try to harmonize Darwinian evolution and more specifically the billions of years with the days of creation. So that's kind of where I want to go next when we study Genesis, is talk about that. But again, that line of thinking is irrational. Okay, either, well, I guess that's the bell. No, he didn't have to start over because he had 8 souls that were saved through water. He destroyed everything but them, and then they became fruitful and multiplied again.